Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Treating the Individual Patient, Empowering Early Disease Detection and Personalized Care, presented by Bioformis. I'm Liz Wesky, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Anthony Lettenberger, Senior Vice President, Life Science Partnerships at Bioformis, Sarah Ernst, Senior Director, Digital Strategy and Partnerships at Sanofi, David Cowett, Executive Director, Head of Enabling Functions, Strategy and Operations at Pfizer, and Aurel Swenson, MD, Medical Director, Digital Therapeutics at Bioformis. You can read their full bios on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. Just a few technical notes before we begin. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please ensure that your volume is all the way turned up. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. Time permitting, we will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Questions and Answers tab on the left side of your screen. Okay, now let's begin. Anthony, please go ahead.
Thanks, Liz. Hey, everyone. I'm Anthony Lettenberger. As Liz said, I'm Senior Vice President, Life Science Partnerships at Bioformis. I've been in the industry over 30 years. I've spent most of my career in healthcare data, tech, and analytics, helping customers navigate how to use technology to improve outcomes. I've recently headed up the FDA regulatory sciences area, and I've also worked with real-world evidence and outcomes research. So, Sarah, let's hear a little bit more from you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Anthony. I'm Sarah Ernst, as Liz mentioned, and I've worked at Sanofi for the last 4 years, and I've spent the better part of the last decade working at the intersection of technology and healthcare. At my time in Sanofi, I've led digital innovation for our rare disease team, as well as working on our strategy and partnerships teams to bring new technology and collaborations focused on real-world evidence, clinical innovation, digital biomarkers, digital therapeutics, and more. And I'm excited to be here today to talk about the progress we've made so far and the progress we need to make.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. David.
Hi, everybody. My name is David Cowett. I'm Executive Director in the Digital Sciences and Translational Imaging Group at Pfizer. I've been at Pfizer for just over 21 years, and I currently lead strategy, operations, project management for our group. Our team provides subject matter expertise with deployments of digital health tools in clinical trials, spanning across therapeutic areas and development phases. I also oversee a medical informatics team and the Pfizer Innovation Research Lab we call the Fire Lab, an instrumented clinical space in Cambridge where we conduct phase 0 methodology studies to test new wearable devices, digital tools, etc., before deploying them into larger studies. It's a pleasure to be here today and to share my experience at Pfizer with you.
Great. Thank you, David. Aurel.
Hey, everybody. I'm Aurel Swenson. I'm the Medical Director for Digital Therapeutics here at Bioformis. Prior to joining Bioformis, a little over a year and a half ago, I practiced as an emergency medicine doctor for several years. During that time, I also had several entrepreneurial endeavors and worked briefly in venture capital on the other side of this world, so to speak, in terms of looking at prospective digital and med tech investments and their opportunities for success. Here at Bioformis, I work primarily in a client-facing manner, working with pharma partnerships as well as some of our academic partnerships and liaison with the digital science team and data science teams internally to try to guide what we can develop in terms of digital medicines.
All right. Thank you, Aurel. Well, great. Let's jump in. So the first thing we'd like to talk about is what are the pain points in patient care? You know, we're living in a very exciting time, and certainly technology is improving our lives in many areas. And in healthcare, digital therapeutics is one area where it's dramatically making an impact. However, there are some pain points to it. There are these 4 areas where we look at access to clinical trials. You know, they say that only 5% of Americans have participated in clinical trials. I see and have read reports that sometimes it's 1% to 3%. So getting to the table to be able to have access to groundbreaking medications and therapies is critically important, and a lot of folks do not have access to it. In fact, the numbers are even less in certain racial, ethnic minority groups. So it's very important that we could use this technology to allow additional patients access to this type of care or to these types of trials. Proper diagnosis and access to therapies. You know, outpatient misdiagnosis rates are extremely high at 5%, around 12 million patients per year. 1/3 of those patients are reporting difficulties getting medications because of the process of getting access. Another area is managing medications and side effects. This is an area that could be significantly reduced with a proactive approach, leveraging digital technology. And the last area here is disease understanding and motivation to stay on therapy. After meeting with a physician and being appropriately diagnosed, 40 to 60% of patients could not accurately or correctly report their physician's directions in a very short period of time after being seen. Adherence drops off dramatically for patients taking chronic illnesses. So today we're going to dig into this a little bit. And so what I'd like to do is ask David the first question about your experience and thoughts about the impact of digital on access to clinical trials. David?
Thanks, Anthony. So I think that one of the biggest reasons why only 5% of Americans have participated in clinical trials, and of that 5%, only 16% were from minority groups, is access to clinical trial sites. So a person might live too far away from the site. They may not be able to take the time off from work or school, maybe having to care for a child or an elderly family member. They may have physical limitations that makes it hard to move around and go to a study visit. It could be caused by a lot of reasons. The end result is that someone does not take part in a clinical trial. And this is an area where new technologies can help. So digital health tools enable the conduct of decentralized clinical trials, basically finding the participants where they are and bringing the clinical trial to them. In a clinical trial, someone could enroll via an app on their smartphone. They could be shipped a kit to their home, including a wearable device and instructions how to use it, maybe even a treatment course, and being able to do everything without needing to physically come to a study site. This enables more people to participate in trials, and it increases clinical trial diversity by enrolling participants from everywhere around the country, ensuring the trial participants more closely represent the diversity makeup of our country. Moreover, if you think of a rare disease clinical trial, there's probably a small number of patients that are spread across the US. If you want to conduct a study and need to recruit many of those, it could be challenging. Running a decentralized clinical trial using the digital health tool could make the recruitment possible by bringing the trial to them wherever they are, at their doorstep, enrolling a high number of patients rapidly, and ultimately developing a treatment for these folks as quick as possible.
Well, that's great, David. I've also read additional reports that talk about patients, for example, that are diagnosed with cancer, that upwards of 90% of those diagnosed patients do not live within a 2-hour drive of a major hospital or major academic institution. So this ties in nicely to what you just described. Let's move on. Let's move on to the second box, access to therapy and payer coverage. Sarah, what's been your experience and your thoughts in this area?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot baked into that topic there. And I think the first part of accessing therapy is knowing what disease you have and getting the right diagnosis at the right time. I think we know our healthcare system is very delayed, and it's hard for even the most connected patients, most health literate patients to get into a system. And then when they get to the system, to be able to converse with their HCPs appropriately, with insights about their own health, about their own disease journey, to really have a better conversation. So I think one of the biggest opportunities we're seeing is the opportunity to use real world data to bring about better insights to diagnosis and the diagnosis journey. And that's not just getting the first diagnosis, but it's continuing to manage and monitor the disease. I think for our patients, you often are getting chronic diseases or ones that have a progressive journey. So where you start in your diagnosis journey might not be where you are in 2 or 3 years. And so that real world data you can collect from any point, from both your claims and when patients have come to the doctor prior to receiving the correct diagnosis, once you're diagnosed, and then once you're on therapy, is really helpful for our patients. And so I think the data and the ability to collect the data, understand the data, and feed it back to both patients and the providers is a very strong opportunity that everyone's currently taking advantage of.
Right. Thank you, sir. That brings up a really good point with real world data and real world evidence applies on both sides, right? On the clinical trial side, as David spoke to, as well as on the commercial side that you just addressed. It ties nicely with the FDA asking through the 21st Century Cures Act that the FDA is asking companies to provide more real world data in the clinical trials process. And then clearly, as we make better decisions moving forward, what's happening in the real world on the commercialization side. So thank you for that. That's great. So there were two other areas that we were going to discuss around managing medication and side effects, as well as disease understanding and motivations to stay on therapy. So Aurel, would you like to address that?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for the introduction there, Anthony. I think the highlight around digital biomarkers and digital medicines as it pertains to patients staying on therapy has a lot to do with very obvious gaps in care that we're aware of, right? If you were to bucket them, for the most part, as you highlighted previously, most patients can't recall what the physician or healthcare provider told them minutes after the visit, quite literally. And that's assuming that the physician or caretaker had the time to do a good job, which admittedly in our healthcare system often isn't the case. So bucket one is the patient doesn't know what they're supposed to do. If they don't know what they're supposed to do, they're very, very unmotivated to go get the medications that they need to take. And even if those two barriers are overcome and they're taking the medications they're supposed to take for the disease that they might understand, they're then still left with the adverse event situation. The adverse event situations, again, from minor to severe, and it's all relative to how bad the disease is in the patient's mind, are a primary reason for medication discontinuation. All of this, on some level, can be solved through digital biomarker, digital therapeutic development, depending on how you span the patient care spectrum. Whether you're delivering educational material that is more easily accessible, including educational material about the adverse event, about the drug itself, about the side effect profile, and at the most robust levels, offering patients the opportunity to connect with healthcare providers through apps and through these programs that, so you hit your adverse event, you don't understand your disease, you want to drop the medication, but you have an easy way to chat with your doctor, all that begins to fall apart and fall away and makes that barrier to medication adherence start to dissipate.
Yeah, those are really, really good points. And you know what, to both Sarah and David, I'm going to ask Sarah first. Are there any words of wisdom that you could say when deploying these programs about how to, how do we get this technology into the hands of the patients, and how do we get the treating physicians to adopt this technology?
Absolutely. I think this is actually my favorite question, the most important question we have to ask, because I always, tell our teams and when I work with companies, I tell them we can build the best application in the world. If we don't know how to get it to the right person at the right time, it doesn't matter how good it is. And so I think you need to understand what is the patient journey, what is the HCP journey as well. I think, from the other sides of our healthcare patriots in the world, they're overburdened with, too many alerts, too many new solutions. And so how can we fit into the patient journey? When are they feeling sick? When are they considering themselves a patient? I think one thing our industry does is we refer to people as patients as that's their identity forever. And truthfully, any one of us, when we feel sick, we don't want to stay in the patient category. We want to leave that. So when we feel like patients is the right time to find them, activate on adherence, and use that journey and use that mental space of the patient to really get that right solution in the right hands at the right time.
Thank you, Sarah. That was extremely well said, and I like that. I identify with that. David, what's been your experience in deploying these programs?
Yeah, I think that building on what Sarah just said, one of the problems we encounter in trying to understand the patient journey, especially in a clinical trial, is that the person would enroll in a clinical trial. They will come to a study site, do a few tests, maybe be given a treatment and go home. And oftentimes there's no way to know what happens at home in between doctor's visits. So using novel technology, wearable devices, digital health tools, enables us to see what happens in between doctor's visits. So if you take, for example, a patient that suffers from atopic dermatitis, they feel itchy, they scratch their skin. Oftentimes they do that at night, but they don't remember how frequently or how long they itched and they scratched, and they have to fill out a diary in the morning. That's kind of the the way to recall that, right? What if you can use a wearable device that you can put on the wrist and that could be trained to recognize a scratching event and quantify that? It would minimize the burden on the patient having to try to remember that in the morning and filling out a diary. And it would give some more accurate data to the care team that treats that patient.
That's great. Great insight, David. Thank you. Aurel, I've got a question for you. As a physician, could you tell us from your perspective, when treating certain patients like in oncology, and specifically in CAR T therapies, where some of these treatments can have neurotoxicity and other adverse events, can you talk a little bit about the physician's perspective on the benefits of using this and what's important to the treating physician?
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's the obvious answer is, of course, being able to monitor the patient, as David was pointing out, more robustly and continuously, and getting that level of insight that removes a lot of the subjective nature of recall and subsequent recall bias that's inevitable in any kind of disease state. And looking, of course, at oncology and cancer treatment, the adverse event profile is quite robust, and patients wanting to drop off that therapy as a result of that is high. Conversely, again, highlighting earlier, if we can catch those adverse events before they get to severe states through digital medicine, through digital biomarkers, et cetera, and intervene earlier and earlier, we have that opportunity to, again, drive better adherence and reduce at the best case scenario, reduce morbidity and mortality rates as a result of that. But of course, in the physician, as Sarah pointed out correctly, the physician landscape is one that's difficult to navigate in terms of making sure you fit well into the care pathway, and also that you can explain how your algorithm or your process or product actually works without creating additional barriers, burdens, and headaches that add to the significant red tape that's already out there. And I think that's one of the larger challenges as we roll these out.
That's great. That's a great perspective. And it also sets up for our next topic. So thank you all. Digital medicine transforming biopharma's product lifecycle. So let's take a look at this. And again, let's look at it from both sides of the equation, the clinical trials, clinical development area, as well as commercialization. So if we focus on the left side, digital medicine is actually creating novel insights into therapy response for individualized treatment. And so this is something that Sarah, David, and Aurel have addressed around the movement from population health to individualized care, to personalized care. We're taking the next step towards getting closer to treating the individual patient. And by doing that, we can identify what's actually happening to them below the skin, what's happening with their individual biomarkers and their unique physiology. Developing these digital biomarkers really is going to drive and is driving effectiveness and safety of these therapies, of these medications, which is incredibly important. Some other areas that we're seeing great progress in is dosing optimization or dosing titration, as well as the ability to detect adverse events at the earliest possible time by picking up a patient's individual biomarkers and seeing at the earliest possible time any deterioration or any sign or signal of heading towards disease or adverse events. Another area is gaining insights on these trial populations. As David and the rest of the team has discussed, getting access to folks who ordinarily would not have access to these trials is incredibly important to the trial and certainly to the individuals participating in those trials. On the commercial side, as Sarah mentioned very, very well, driving better adherence through personalized patient engagement and education. This is a means to actually do that. We can provide additional real-world evidence, real-world data, and post-market monitoring, risk management using software as a medical device, leveraging artificial intelligence and machine learning. And then, as Aurel mentioned, gaining insights on what the patient experiences and in combination with real-world evidences. What we think we may have done may be different from what we actually did. So it's important to be able to clinically validate that along that journey. And then from a marketing perspective, how do we optimize therapy and protect market share and protect exclusive or loss of exclusivity, generic intrusion, heading towards the ultimate retirement of a potential product, it's really important to be able to maximize the diagnosis and ultimately the treatment by that product. So with that, I'm going to again ask some key questions around this. So I'd like to start by talking to David. What do you see as some of the major pain points along the product life cycle, and how are you addressing them at Pfizer?
Thanks, Anthony. So I'll start from the slide you just showed. I'll start with the left side, the clinical development side. So, and as we mentioned before, it all starts with the patient, right? At Pfizer, the patient is our North Star. So the first step is to understand from them what is the unmet need, what endpoints are meaningful to them, and how can you measure these endpoints using some of the new tools we're talking about. So going back to my previous example with dermatitis, how can we automatically measure nighttime scratching without the patient needing to fill out their diary in the morning, right? So once we've gotten the patient feedback and we know what we want to measure, the second step is figuring out what's the best device for the job. So there's tons of different wearables out there. Which ones collects the right type of data? And then what's the right body location to place it? What does the data look like? And how do you analyze this data to extract meaningful endpoints out of this? Now, the next step is deploying those into clinical studies, right? And we encounter that all the time where the clinical teams have their mandate. They have a protocol they want to run. They have a timeline. They have a budget. So some of the questions we'll get is it going to cost me more? Is it going to delay me? Is that going to cause patients to not be compliant with the protocol or not want to enroll? So it's important to get in alignment with the clinical study team and share with them the added value of the digital health tool to their studies. So for example, if they're struggling with recruitment, perhaps decentralized trial can help them find people where they are and recruit much faster. In parallel to that, and lastly, there's a huge need to partner with the regulatory authorities to share information with them about what we can measure and how we measure it, and collect their feedback as to what they would need to see in order to be convinced that the digital endpoint is measuring the right thing in the right way. So those are just a couple of examples of things we have to think about on the clinical development side to get to develop a digital endpoint that ultimately would end up in the clinic and in the hands of patients.
Those are great points. Thank you, David. So Sarah, on the commercial side, what do you see as the major pain points upon the post-approved product lifecycle?
Yeah, it's funny. I think everything David said pretty much applies to commercial. The unmet patient need doesn't change when they're looking to enroll in a clinical trial versus looking to get a therapy that's been studied and approved. Nighttime scratch, we still need to know, did the medicine actually do what we said it would? We're working with the regulatory authorities. Also is still uncharted territory. I know we've had a couple of early success stories, but there's not one model that everybody can plug into and feels like is working for pharma, for our DTX and SAMD solutions. But I do see an opportunity to connect the measurement from the clinical side into the therapeutic and intervention from the commercial side. Very few teams are doing this so far, but I actually think that's where some of the opportunity to surmount those hurdles lies. And lastly, I think on the commercial side, especially if you're talking about biologics, specialty care, the financials are still in flux as well. These are very expensive drugs. And so how you fit in a healthy financial model to invest in the digital therapies while maintaining your focus on the other areas has been something that I think all of our peers are still trying to figure out.
That's really great and very insightful. And you're right. We live and we're all working. We have our own departments and our own business initiatives to attend to. But this is an excellent way to not act in such a siloed fashion within the company and use it as a bridge between clinical and commercial. Sarah, I have another question for you. How do you measure the success of these types of programs?
Well, I think we're all still working on that too. It's easier a little bit to talk about the pain points right now than it is to talk about the success, because I think on the day in, day out, you're more aware of your pains. But we do try to pause and celebrate the success. I think for me and for Sanofi, patient first. So are we able to show patient impact some way, either in the clinical trial? So as David was mentioning, it's really important to create as many opportunities for an easier trial for the patient. Even if we're not seeing the economics yet, the more efficient it is for the patient, the less burdensome it is for somebody, say, with ALS to participate in a trial, the better we are doing as an industry to deliver those solutions. So I try to put the patient first and then all the other monitors second. Of course, I'm a big believer too in using our current scientific frameworks. So, measures we know are great, starting with those and trying to improve.
Right. So, David, on your side, on the clinical trial side, how would you measure success of this type of a program?
So I would measure success in trying to. So there's a couple of different levels, right? If these tools enable us to make go no go decisions quicker and focus our resources on the clinical trials that have the greatest chances of helping the most people the quicker, that's how you are going to measure success for implementing these tools into the clinical development pipeline. At the end of the day, what we want to do is get something that treats patients out as fast as possible. So, I mean, this is the end point right here. Is that the quicker you can make your decision, and it could be that sometimes the additional insights you will get from these digital endpoints will lead you to kill a program quicker, and that's okay, because then you can focus the resources somewhere else and accelerate something else that's going to benefit patients, as opposed to maybe you would have needed to kill that program anyway, but it would have taken you another 6 months or a year, and so it's less efficient.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's some commonality, right, on both sides. It's around having access. It's around getting patients on product, getting on therapy, staying on therapy, optimizing that therapy, minimizing any side effects or adverse events, and really driving towards improved outcomes for that population. Aurel, is there anything else that you'd like to add from the physician's perspective on what the success of a program would look like?
Sure. Yeah, I think. I mean, it's certainly pharma has the right mindset here for sure. Unsurprisingly, right? It's a matter of can you get patients to minimize your adverse event profile, stay on the medication, but that is of course all the real world outcomes that we want to see as well. Our patients need to stay on their drugs, on the medication we prescribe them, to make sure that they actually capitalize on their outcomes. I think perhaps one of the biggest pain points as you go through the development of these products is the more advanced they become from algorithm development perspectives, the more challenging it is to convey to the physicians how they function, how they work. You hear terms about black box algorithms, and that certainly is a pain point in terms of how did you reach these conclusions, and why should I believe something I can't understand anyways? And that's not meant to be derogatory. I mean, it's very complicated, and on top of that, we often talk about models that continue to learn and develop over time, raising only more questions about that. I think it's certainly an area that, from an educational perspective, at a healthcare systems level, we'll need to take on head on if we want to see these programs succeed and adopted with comfort by the care providers in general.
That's great. Thank you, Aurel. There is one more question I'd like to ask both David and Sarah. I'll start with Sarah first. It's around in a world where companies, well, now in a world where it really is a buy, build, or partner world, which means, right, you could buy a company, you could build it yourself, or you could partner with a company that already specializes. Tell us your approach on how do you approach a true long-term strategic relationship that's mutually beneficial versus a simple vendor relationship, because there is a difference.
Yeah,
Sarah?
absolutely. Yeah, thank you. I think, from a strategic partnership perspective, this is a cliche saying, but we're really looking for 1 + 1 = 3. So there is a company that comes with a set of assets and capabilities that we either don't have in-house or don't have available to shake loose and put towards another problem or challenge in-house. And so what we can provide is the expertise of bringing a molecule or drug from research development to commercialization. We know that very well. And then there are many technology companies out there that are very good at artificial intelligence, at creating digital medicines and really moving into new spaces with those technologies. And so the opportunity, like I said, to bring both companies together, and really the goal is to roll your sleeves up and build something together, versus on the vendor side, it may be a critically important technology, critical to the success of any program in the company, but there may be less collaboration and co-development together to bring that to the market. We can rely a little more on the technology company to do some of that work for us, or the collaboration is a bit more about the integrations rather than creating something new.
Really good points. Thank you, Sarah. David, from your perspective, is there anything else that you would add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100% with Sarah. As she said, right, the key is self-awareness, is knowing what you're good at and what you're not good at. And for a pharma company like Pfizer, developing drugs that help patients is what we do. Building novel wearable devices is not, right? So for example, when we want to develop a novel digital endpoint, it makes sense to look at partners, these companies that might make these wearable devices. But beyond that, there's a whole ecosystem of partners that we connect with in this basically drug development process. So it starts with the patient, and as an extension of the patient advocacy groups. So we need to learn from them how to better design protocol that fits their needs, right? Then there's there's the academic institutions around where we can work with them to jointly run studies in patient populations that they might have access with and experience with. Now taking it to the next level, there's multi-stakeholders consortia like IMI in Europe, or the Digital Medicine Society, which brings together folks from academia, from pharma, from the regulatory agencies, vendors, and working on tackling some problems together. And of course, the regulatory agencies, last but not least, we need to work hand in hand with them to see what it is that we can do and what it is that they require us to do. So it takes a village. It's not something that we can do by ourselves. And I think the field has gotten better at working together, putting this in direction.
That's great. Thank you, David. And thank you to all of you. Very thorough answers and a lot of insight here today. So as we wrap this up, I'd like to turn it over back to Liz to Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Anthony. All right, so we are going to be moving on to the Q&A portion of today's webinar. There is still time to submit your questions using that Q&A tab to the left side of your screen. That said, we have a lot of great questions already, so we'll get to as many as we were able to. So diving right into our first question here. So there is a lot of data through devices and patient reports within a clinical trial, but in real-world treatment, it's still an open system without that closed research loop. What examples are you seeing of these new technologies being used to close that feedback loop in therapy delivery?
Wow, that's a really great question. It's in depth, and there are different ways to answer it, I think. David, would you like to take the first try?
As I formulate my thoughts.
Oh. I can take a quick stab at it. Indeed, I agree. It's an in-depth question, so thank you for that. I think some of those basic principles apply in terms of establishing your foundation with the open loop system. I think where we're seeing research being done is a lot with real world evidence studies, taking devices and measuring them in populations. What are you finding? You still need to create correlations before you can move it up the chain for either sort of interventions or clear understanding of causation. So I know our Med Affairs team, or teams rather, have run multiple studies to really understand what is what does actigraphy mean in a commercial population in a specific disease? Do we see any correlation to how they self-report their disease and how they sort of biologically respond to their therapy? And then does their actigraphy data match that?
That's great. Aurel, is there anything from your perspective that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, to be honest, I'll be a little more pessimistic about it. I think that there are some major problems around the way existing data is structured. It's not as uniform as I want to believe it is. EMR systems only speak to each other to a certain degree. There are certainly major data gaps. And the one thing I'll highlight is the new tools, and particularly new wearables, are giving us the opportunity to measure and monitor patients in ways we've never done before. You were never on 24/7 monitoring while being healthy. That would be a total waste of resources, but we have that for the first time. There's no way to pull that kind of data accurately, map it to new tools, and hope that you're going to have something that speaks the new language based on the old tools and old designs. And I think that in some ways, people are frustrated by that because they want to be able to use all the information sitting out there. But unfortunately, in reality, there's many use cases where that can't be done.
Great. Thank you so much for those responses.
All right, thank you.
All right. Moving right along to our next question here. Or Anthony, did you want to weigh in on that one, or are we good to move along?
No, we're good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, so diving right into our next question here. So, you mentioned trying to advance motivation to stay on therapy. A big part of this motivation often comes from a patient's family and caregivers. Are you seeing any advances in these digital patient tools that expand the patient's wider care circle?
So I'd like to start with that. So when we work with our customers, just as Aurel just said, we're entering into a stage in really the evolution of care where we are monitoring patients who are in the normative range or the healthy range. So that's allowing us as a community, right, to have visibility into what's going on. It also allows the patient to take an active role in their care. It allows their caregivers and usually the families around them to also take an active role. So we're seeing people having more enthusiasm and awareness, as David said earlier. Awareness is a really big first step in many areas, and in this area, it's especially important as people take a more active role in their care. Aurel, do you want to expand on that a little bit from a physician perspective?
Yeah, I think as you teed it up quite well, we know without a doubt that the family, close friends, relatives, etc., certainly play a key role in the success of most, I'll say, advanced disease states. People who are genuinely sick from anything that's more than a common cold, so to speak. Accessing them and making them part of your solution has a significant upside, right? If you can figure out how to do it and develop systems that are essentially the medical equivalent of social media, and bringing the patient support program together that says, all right, we all understand the pain points of our caretakers, etc., of our patients as caretakers. And the other area that we see, I should rephrase, I'm sorry, we've known for a long time that the caretakers themselves often become patients in the process. And so as we build out solutions, think about ways to engage the caretaker community, it also opens the opportunity to say, how are you feeling today in terms of the caretakers themselves, and keeping an eye on them overall, because their failure portends the patient's failure as well. And I think that that's something we can achieve with digital medicines, or digital technologies, I should say, much more easily than we have with any other systems in the past.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, maybe on
And
taking a different spin on this, that oftentimes the caretakers, if providing care to their loved one is difficult, if you have to take time off from work and you have to, drive several hours, and it is a burden on them, and it's difficult to keep providing that day in and day out. If we can, use the new technologies to make the trials decentralized, where you ship something home and the caretaker doesn't have to do as much, it would be much easier then for the caretaker to keep helping the patient, stick with the treatment and be compliant. So making life easier for the caretaker is a big thing as well. And it helps with compliance for the entire care team, the patient and his or her caretaker.
Great. Sarah, did you want
Great.
to add to that? See your enthusiasm.
Yeah, I think I don't have, I agree very strongly with what everyone said. It's a known challenge. And I'm glad, RL, you mentioned that the caretaker themselves often becomes a patient in their own right. I've seen it, since I've been working in this area for the last decade or so, and I've seen it in my family and my personal life. It's really hard and challenging. I think the challenge of addressing this from the first patient in perspective, not from the clinical trial standpoint, not FPI as we know it, but the first encounter with the patient. It's hard currently in the system we have for pharma, at least, and even for the medical system to say, hey, partner of our new patient here, let's get you, in the system and let's get you monitored. It's not really how we're designed. So I look forward to continued innovations in this space. I think you mentioned social media as a part of it, but to my earlier point, how do we engage with these people before they become chronically ill, either with depression or other physical symptoms?
Great. Thank you all for those responses. All right, it looks like we have one more question to get to here, so I'll dive right into our final question for today's webinar. So, new technologies are great, but how are you getting solutions into the hands of patients at scale? There seem to be a lot of challenges in that last mile delivery for digital treatments.
Yeah, that's a great question, Liz. And often, right, no matter how good your solution is, if it's not implemented properly or in the hands of the right folks, it's not going to be very effective. But Sarah, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I think this goes to what we talked about a little bit earlier, which is understanding where the patient is and how to find them and plug into their journey. And to be more specific in the answer to the question, we haven't figured it out yet. I think a lot of different solutions and companies are trying different ways, whether it's the patient support program from the pharma company, whether it's the integrating with the EMR system to try to track the patient journey that way. I think a lot of shots on goal are being taken, which is fantastic. And I'm hopeful that people will be transparent with what's working and what's not working as we move through this next phase.
That's great. We discussed earlier today around strategic relationships versus simple vendor relationships. And strategic partnerships generally involve the aspects that you discussed, right? Being collaborative, figuring it out, and working together to make sure that we provide that solution. So it's definitely moving in the right direction. Being able to have a more turnkey, comprehensive solution is definitely a way to help address this. There's an old saying in this business, right? You don't want to be a data dumper, which means you don't just drop off a box and say, hey, good luck. But you really work to make sure that it's a seamless integration into the current plan and that there's enough support to be able to deliver. David, any final
Yeah, and
thoughts
Anthony,
from your perspective on this?
I mean, one thing I would add to that is that a key to deploy that at scale and make sure people use it is make it part of their everyday life. So if people walk around with smartphones and smartwatches, if you can deploy a tool that works with those smartphones and smartwatches, and they don't have to do something more, they don't have to wear two watches or have a second phone. If you can leverage what people are already using in their everyday life, you greatly increase your chances of adoption and basically the participant, the patients, the caregivers continuing to use it more than just a couple of weeks and then after that giving it up, right? So I think that figuring out really what is their everyday life and how can you integrate that in their everyday life without asking for much more of an effort from them.
All right. That was great. Well, that's great, Liz. Thank you so much today. and for the panelists as well. I'd like to turn it over to you and close it out.
Great. Great. Well, thank you so much. And I would like to thank everyone in our audience for attending this Fierce Pharma webinar and for submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for participating and Bioformis for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded, and you will be able to access that recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again so much for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.